y'all, and welcome back to the channel. Y'all know usually I end up talking about Colonial Virginia, usually along the frontier. I might talk a little bit about Pennsylvania, the Ohio River Valley, right? But in this video, I thought we should turn our attention northward and talk about an interesting part of New York's history. All the colonies, they're founded at different times, different groups of people for different reasons, taking different paths. So like the development of these colonies are all completely different. And talking specifically about European colonization of these areas, what we call New York was first colonized by the Dutch, and they called it New Netherlands. And that was in the Hudson Valley, and then we have New Sweden in the Delaware Valley, settled by the Swedes, obviously. So New Netherland kind of takes over New Sweden, and this whole area encompassed part of what we now would consider New York, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and even Delaware. And the founding of New Netherland, it was all about the Dutch East India Company's pursuits of fur and other North American resources. So they're not settling this as, our people have, some religious dispute or some other issue where they want to start off fresh somewhere else. This is all about making it easier to conduct commerce. And the English, they're not thrilled about New Netherland because it's right there in the middle between Virginia and Massachusetts, and it's kind of cutting their colonies off from one another and getting in the way of English ambitions to spread out, right? But the Dutch are fellow Protestants. They are usually allies. When, if there's a war with France or with Spain, the Dutch and the English are usually allies. So what are you going to do? New Netherland did tend to welcome religious dissenters, but that's a separate issue. That's really not the problem here. So King Charles II of England and his brother James, the Duke of York, they end up eventually taking New Netherland. And this is how we get the colony New York, and that's where you get the name of it. And that happens around the year 1667 with the Navigation Acts. And that's kind of like a whole separate history I'll have to delve into more later, but I just wanted to give you this kind of general background on the colony. Because we're actually going to jump forward a little bit by about a century to 1766 is when these riots take place and what leads up to them. So as it turned out, at the beginning of New York colony, some wealthy men had managed to get these massive land grants there. And I mean massive. Elsewhere, a patent of, say 10,000 acres, that would have been considered really rare and notable, and just how on earth did you get that much? But in New York, one man, he gets 1,000,000 acres, for example. Another man, he gets 200,000 acres. I mean, this is an unreal amount of land here. The Board of Trade in England, they take notice, and they later require that New York not grant any grants larger than 2,000 acres. And then in 1753, that gets lowered again to 1,000 acres, which is much more in line with what you might see in other colonies. And it's a big difference, right? 1,000 compared to 1,000,000, that's a lot of zeros making up the difference there. So some historians have dubbed these landowners as the American equivalent of feudal lords. To be fair, historians like Patricia Bonomi, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, apologies if I'm not, but she says that's inappropriate because, it doesn't completely fit here in New York. But you'll see the references anyway. Some of these landowners, or manor lords as you might call them, they could potentially act as a judge regarding any civil or criminal matters that take place on their lands. They could prevent people from hunting or fishing. They could do a number of other things. It varied from one manor to the next. There's no consistent, okay, if we go to this one grant, you're going to have this, and then you go over here, it's going to be exactly the same. It all kind of varied, which makes the topic kind of more complicated. But honestly, I do see where the feudal reference makes sense because there are those comparisons, even if it's not 100% the same. Bonomi ends up summarizing the problem that, contributes to the riots by saying, quote, "A few rich and powerful New Yorkers chose to withhold from the market several million acres of prime land, to the great exasperation of small farmers who saw themselves excluded from one of the most fertile regions in the New World," end quote. So unlike England, where land is limited, there were other options in America, right? We've seen that from everything that was going on along the frontier in Pennsylvania and Virginia. We know there's various means to either, get grants for land or just go set up shop somewhere and say, screw officially having this land. But not everyone wanted to go to the frontier. Some people wanted to be closer to the coast. They didn't want to go through all that. And especially not when there's this fertile land here in New York that just looks especially tempting. And it's really close nearby, but these manor lords aren't letting us have it. And to kind of explain the geography of it a little bit. So the manor lords, when they got tenants for their lands, they tended to settle those tenants closer to the Hudson River because, of course, rivers make transportation much easier. So they would settle them first on the Hudson River, and then after that, then they would move eastward from there. Normally we would think of settlement as starting in one place, moving westward. Well, it's the opposite here. And the end result is when these manor lords don't fill up all of their land with tenants, the eastern areas of New York end up vacant. They haven't been settled. They don't have any tenants. So the land that's vacant is really, really close to other colonies who are eyeing it and being like, wait a minute, there's nothing going on here. Why can't I just have it? Why can't I take it? But getting back for a moment to those tenants and the comparison between the feudal lords of England, in New York, if someone sold their lease to another tenant, they had to pay about 1/4 of the value of the land to the landlord, even though ownership of the land is not being transferred. These are called alienation fees, and it could be even higher than 1/4. Landlords could require that the tenants pay all of the taxes on the land that they're leasing. They could require the tenant take all of their grain or other crops to the landlord's mill, or otherwise give the landlord, first pick. Only if the landlord turned down the crop could the tenant then go and sell it on the open market. And again, this varies from one manor to the next. A lot of these tenants would have been poor immigrants, potentially Irish or German speaking, but there's also a lot of Dutch. One of my cats is upset with the other one. Anyway, there are also a lot of Dutch, which makes sense given that this was initially New Netherlands. When the English take it over, they're not evicting all the Dutch people. They're just saying, hey, we're in charge now. So these are all things that might understandably frustrate tenants. And that's not what led to the riots, though. And that's the thing. If you see these riots of 1766 mentioned in a history book, and it's just like it's a survey of American history, it's not getting into detail here, you might see this reference and think, oh, okay, well, the tenants, there was a tenant uprising because they were unhappy with conditions. That's not actually what happened. I've talked a lot about the conflicting charters between Virginia and Pennsylvania and how both of them felt entitled to the Ohio River Valley, right? And we're getting some of that here because Massachusetts and Connecticut, they both tried to lay claim to land that's also claimed by the colony of New York. And when the boundaries get challenged in court, New York tends to win. Or challenged with the king, I guess I should say. But at the same time, like I said, that contested New York land that's vacant is in the eastern part of New York, right near the borders of Massachusetts and Connecticut. So it's looking really good to them, and it's really nearby. And it's like putting a pile of candy next to a kid and telling them they can't have any. Well, they're going to be eyeing it up anyway, no matter what you say. So you put this unused land under the nose of some New Englanders that really want to expand, and the result is chaos. And this isn't even covering the land theft from American Indians and how that contributed to these manor lands, because, well, I'm trying to get to the topic of the riots, and if I keep talking about everything else, we'll never get there. It happens with a lot of my videos. But the issues that we're discussing here, they mainly took place in New York's Albany, Dutchess, and Westchester counties, right? So some New Englanders were able to obtain land there, whether by purchasing it or leasing it, but many, many more were not. So what do? They start squatting on the land, thinking that they'd be able to get away with it long enough that by the time the matter might go to court, they'd have a stronger claim because of the land improvements they'd made. Or, even if a court didn't really care about that, maybe the owner would eventually give them a lease because of all the hard work that they've been putting in. And there seems to be this mentality that whoever's not making use of land, by whatever definition you choose to use, was automatically not entitled to keep it. So we see that first with the initial settlements of Europeans, where they look at the American Indian tribes and their use of the land, and they think, well, they're not making use of the land as well as we would, so we're entitled to obtain it one way or the other, and it's okay, it's justified because we're going to make better use of the land. So that justification gets used initially, and then it comes up again later because now the New Englanders are saying, well, these New Yorkers, they're not making use of the land, so shouldn't we just be able to take it? And this group of New Englanders, or squatters, however you want me to refer to them, they had such low regard for these manor lords who own all of this land that some of these people from Massachusetts, they're telling long-term tenants in New York that they're fools for even paying rent. So they're not just coming in and squatting and kind of going about their business and that's that, but they're also interfering with the tenants that were already there and trying to convince them, well, you don't have to pay rent. You don't have to follow these rules. Who's going to make you? And we see this continue throughout the mid-1750s. In some cases, New York landowners would have squatters placed in New York jails. And then in other cases, squatters or New Englanders would have New York tenants, like actual legal tenants, taken to Massachusetts jails and were placed on their farm by more Massachusetts squatters. Both sides armed themselves, and blood was shed at different times here. And to be fair, I'm assuming that New York had the right of it, that they had a better claim, but there's certainly room for other opinions. You could say that maybe Massachusetts and Connecticut should have had right to the land. I'm not trying to make a judgment call there. So things cooled off during the French and Indian War because everyone is, their mind is on this war that's going on. They have more important things. But that ends in 1763. And afterwards, once the French are gone and the tribes who had allied with the French are considered defeated, this causes another big push for westward expansion. And to Massachusetts and Connecticut, westward expansion means expanding into those eastern New York lands. And again, so many new settlers are being attracted into these areas, and again, they're getting worked up about this land that is just sitting here and nobody's doing anything with it, and why can't we take it? And there was one particular manor which, had its own problems, the Phillips Highland patent. And it appears they may have claimed more land that they were actually entitled to. Part of this land was also claimed by a local American Indian tribe who had sided with the British during the French and Indian War, right? So they're allies. And allies always feel like, hey, wait a minute, shouldn't you be respecting our rights because we helped you out? Which is valid. So some squatters had gone to the tribe and obtained a long-term lease from the tribe, knowing full well that the land was also claimed by another, whether that's rightfully done or not. And when the matter goes to court, the squatters tended to lose, regardless of their Indian lease, because as far as the government's concerned, the manor lords, they have a piece of paper saying this land is theirs, whether it should be or not. My cats are like heathens today, so every time that the camera kind of shakes, and you might see that on the screen, that's one of them running by. But yeah, so then the tribe is also upset here because their rights are being ignored by the New York government, their claim to this land. In the Phillips Highland patent, it is owned by Phillips, Beverly Robinson, and Roger Morris. And by 1765, the New York government has, sided in court with these men against the tribe, against the New England squatters. So the New Englanders are sitting there like, okay, if we're not going to get a fair day in court, and there's a very good possibility that it was not a fair day in court, because regardless of what their argument would have been, these manor lords kind of had an in with the government, and it didn't really matter. So the New Englanders, they're saying, if we're not going to be dealt with justly, then we're going to take matters into our own hands. It's an attitude we see everywhere throughout the colonies, this sort of independent, I do what I want. I don't know that Americans have lost that attitude either. So anyway, this really starts in Dutchess County, and by April of 1766, it's spread, to the nearby counties. Somewhere between 500 and 2,000 farmers from Dutchess and Westchester, they get this brilliant idea to march on the New York City jail to free some of their squatter buddies who had been arrested. And I know 500 to 2,000 is a very broad estimate there. You will see different numbers listed depending on the source. And let's just pause for a second, because I have a question for you. If you were asked when was the first time that the British Army was used against American colonists, when would you say that was? I think for a lot of us, the first thing that's going to come to mind is Lexington and Concord in 1775. But that's about 9 years in the future at this point, and Governor Moore of New York, he has to do something to stop the mob. And I saw one mention that he called the militia out first, but at some point, Moore also has to call the British regulars. And historian John Gilbert McCurdy says that this is because the provincial council in New York, they were so worried that the militia wouldn't fire on the mob because it's fellow Americans, right? And thus the militia would be unable to stop the mob from overrunning the New York City jail. So because of these concerns, the 28th Regiment, British regulars, is sent out, and later they're joined by detachments from the 46th, the 19th, and the 26th as well. So this is a decent amount of British regulars, and that's essentially what it takes to stop the uprising. One that General Gage refers to as, quote, some confederacies of a dangerous nature, end quote. And I think that particular aspect makes this historically significant to me, because there is this whole debate with the Quartering Act going on at the time. Should we have to support the British Army here in America and kind of, provide for them? There's a lot of dispute there. A lot of people saying, we have no need for the British Army to even be here. Why are they here? Well, yeah, the mob of Dutchess County went and gave them an excuse. So the ringleader of the Dutchess County mob, William Prendergast, he is sentenced to death for high treason because of his involvement and his organization of matters. And it had been a jury trial too. His peers convicted him of this. The judges, though, they asked King George III to pardon Prendergast because they're concerned that given the circumstances of everything and how these squatters felt like they had not gotten a fair day in court earlier on, that if there's a harsh penalty for Prendergast, it's not going to be that example that just, teaches everyone a lesson and they don't act up again. It's going to be something that just gets the mob even more irate and continues the violence, because if they felt like they didn't get justice before, and now they feel like they're still not getting justice, nobody's going to be able to move on. And King George III agreed. So he ends up giving Prendergast a pardon, and everyone is able to move on from there. And of course, a few years later, more things start happening in New York. A few years after that, all of us colonies are declaring our independence. But that is one little detail that I've come across a number of times in a few different books, and most of them, like I said, mentioning surveys of American history, most of those books don't go into detail. They don't tell you why it happened. But I think it's interesting because on the one hand, we had these groups of tenants that, like, okay, maybe we can see why they would be upset because some of these rules are ridiculous. But then we find that it's actually this other group over here of, squatters that are causing all the problems. Although in the course of events, there were a number of the legal tenants who were convinced to join the uprising and take part in all of that as well. So it's not completely clear cut. But by and large, it's the New Englanders, it's the squatters who are just repeatedly like, we're not happy with this, and we're gonna keep raising hell until something changes. Anyway, hopefully you found that interesting. I know I rambled quite a bit. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're interested in helping out the channel or seeing future videos, make sure you hit that like button for me and subscribe if you haven't already. And I will see y'all next time.